Good evening, everyone. It is so wonderful to be able to learn with you once again. Certainly missed having this opportunity on such a regular basis. And Amir Tashem, our learning tonight should be for a refuah shlema for Esther Tila, Bas Ariel Tzipora, Beso Sha'ar, Chole Yisrael. It's so wonderful to see everybody. I've missed this greatly. And Amir Tashem, in the zchus and the merit of our learning, we should approach Elul, Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur with the correct mindset, ready to battle the Yetzer Hara, which is what we're ultimately going to talk about tonight. Tonight is obviously the second part of our four-part series on self-help books in Judaism. How do we take Judaism and apply it to many of the secular books that so many of us are familiar with? And tonight I want to study with you a book called The Screwtape Letters by C.S. Lewis. Now, it's not really a self-help book. It's not like Atomic Habits like Rabbi Goldberg spoke about last week. But rather, as hopefully you'll see, it is an enormously transformative book, one that has had a great impact on me and on my Elul, and I hope that it will have a great impact on you as well. My introduction to this book was actually something that I read once, where Rav Aaron Lichtenstein was asked by one of his students what they should learn, what they should read in the month of Elul, and he recommended this book. And I was intrigued by that. I said, that's awfully strange that he would recommend a Christian theology book to study during the month of Elul. And so I bought it off Amazon. I started to read it, and it is nothing short of transformative. Nothing short of transformative. And so what I want to do tonight is, obviously we cannot go through the entire book, but I want to give you a brief overview of the book, discuss, I think we're going to do 3 or 4 passages from the book, devoting our Jewish perspective or putting our Jewish perspective onto those passages in the book. And then ultimately, I'm going to give a little bit of a lightning round where I'm going to share just a few quotes from the book that were meaningful to me that we're not going to have enough time to develop, but give you some food for thought, things that you can discuss at a Shabbos table, at a Rosh Hashanah table, things that when you're having trouble sleeping at night, that you can't do anything else. So you should think about these passages and let me know if they make as big of an impact on you as they did on me. The ultimate premise of C.S. Lewis's The Screwtape Letters, many of us are familiar with them, is it's a series of letters from a senior devil to a devil in training. The senior devil is named Screwtape, and he is writing to his nephew, whose name is Wormwood. Wormwood is actually a devil in training. Now, you might say to yourself, Rabbi Moskowitz, what a strange book to be learning, to talk about the devil and the devil in training. That sounds very Christian. We are Jews, and it's Elul, and it's approaching Rosh Hashanah. Why are we learning about this? The answer is very simple, that all you have to do is change the word devil for the word Yetzer Hara, and the word enemy in this book, because the enemy of the devil, the enemy of the Yetzer Hara is, of course, the Yetzer HaTov. So the enemy is the Yetzer HaTov. And if you change those terms around, then it becomes the ultimate Musar Sefer. Because what it essentially is the Yetzer Hara describing its tactics to us. And that's what I'm going to focus on. I'm going to focus on 3 or 4 tactics of the Yetzer Hara, how the Yetzer Hara tries to get us, how the Yetzer Hara tries to manipulate our mind, and how ultimately we can overcome it. So I'm going to share some slides with you here this evening. And again, some of it is a little bit more obvious. Some of it hopefully will be new to you. I'm sorry, I just realized I had it on a later page. Okay, here we go. Screwtape Letters, C.S. Lewis. You see the devil, that's probably Screwtape, dragging along his poor subject, who we're going to read about a lot. This poor guy who is trying to get himself to a more religious state, and the Yetzer Hara is preventing him. So again, all you have to do is anytime you see a conversation between Wormwood and Screwtape, to just recognize that that is the Yetzer Hara talking. And when it refers to it in the book as the enemy, that is the Yetzer HaTov. Now, this book is an ultimate fulfillment of a Mishnah in Maseches Brachos, where the Mishnah in Maseches Brachos tells us, we say in Kriya Shema 3 times a day, B'chol levavcha, we have to serve Hashem with our entire heart, says the Mishnah, but Shnei Yitzrecha. What that means is we have to serve Hashem with our 2 Yetzers, our Yetzer HaTov and our Yetzer Hara. Now, classically, it's very easy to understand how we serve Hashem with our Yetzer HaTov, right? I want to do something good. I want to give tzedakah, so I give tzedakah. That's me serving Hashem with my Yetzer HaTov. How do we serve Hashem with our Yetzer Hara? And I think the answer is exactly our class tonight. You serve Hashem with the Yetzer Hara by recognizing the tactics of the Yetzer Hara. Because when we recognize the tactics of the Yetzer Hara, then ultimately we are able to overcome them and use the tactics of the Yetzer Hara in our service of Hashem. So again, as you're going to learn tonight, the tactics of the Yetzer Hara that were described by C.S. Lewis are going to be familiar to many of us, and hopefully by learning about them, we can therefore overcome them. So the first tactic of the Yetzer Hara is procrastination. Trust me, I have a PhD in this tactic of the Yetzer Hara. I just asked my mother, if a paper was due in high school at 8 a.m. on a Tuesday morning, I would start writing it at 7:49 a.m. I mean, that was my level of procrastination. I've gotten a little bit better. It's a running machlokes between me and Rabbi Goldberg, the benefits or the detriments of procrastination, especially as it pertains to writing drushas. But I have a PhD in procrastination. I thought this was very funny. Procrastination is totally a good thing. You always have something to do tomorrow, plus you have nothing to do today. That pretty much describes my entire existence in high school, college, and much of my adult life. So let's study a little bit about procrastination. This comes from the very first letter of C.S. Lewis's Screwtape letters. If you open it up, you will see it. I think it's on the second page. I copied an excerpt for you here, and it is enormously powerful. And I think many of us will relate exactly to what he is talking about. He says, I once had a patient. Again, patient here is a victim. It's us, who the Yetzer Hara and the Yetzer HaTov are trying to battle over. A sound atheist, someone who didn't believe in God, who used to read in the British Museum. One day, as he sat reading, I saw a train of thought in his mind beginning to go the wrong way. All of a sudden, this patient starts thinking about Olam Haba, Olam HaEmes, Torah, mitzvahs. Again, we're going to translate this into Jewish vernacular. The enemy, here being the Yetzer HaTov, of course, was at his elbow. In other words, this guy had the light bulb go off in his head. He was listening to a Musar Shmuz. And so the Yetzer HaTov is right there in a moment. He's there. He wants to pounce on this and convince the guy to change his ways, to convince this guy to live a more ethical and moral lifestyle. Before I knew where I was, I saw my 20 years of work beginning to totter. All of a sudden, all the work that the Yetzer Hara had put into this man was going out the window. Why? Because of one thought. One thought, he's reading the British Museum. If I had lost my head and begun to attempt a defense by argument, I should have been undone. If he starts arguing with the Yetzer HaTov, so he's going to lose, right? Because once you start arguing, at least a person is passionate enough about religious experience that they're willing to toil with it. He goes, I already lost, the Yetzer Hara says. But I was not such a fool. He knows not to get into a fight with the Yetzer HaTov. He knows that that's a losing proposition. So what does he do instead? I struck immediately at the part of man which I had best under my control, and suggested that it was just about time he had some lunch. So here this guy has this epiphany. He's going to live a more ethical, moral lifestyle. And what does the Yetzer Hara do? He says, you should go have some lunch. Come back in 10 minutes and think about it in a little bit. The enemy, being the Yetzer HaTov, presumably made my counter suggestion. This was more important than lunch. So the Yetzer Hara is trying to convince the guy to go to lunch. The Yetzer HaTov says, no, you can't go to lunch. This thought, learning for 5 more minutes, the Musar Shmuz, Mesil Sishar, this is much more important than going to lunch. At least I think that must have been his line, for when I said quiet, in fact, too important to tackle at the end of the morning, the patient brightened up considerably. And by the time I had added much better come back after lunch and go into it with a fresh mind, he was already halfway out the door. So the Yetzer Hara beats the Yetzer HaTov. The Yetzer HaTov says, you can't push this off. This is much more important than lunch. The Yetzer Hara comes back and he says, you know what, you're right. This is so important. It's too important to cram in before lunch. Why don't you go have lunch, clear your head, stop being hangry, and then you come back after lunch and you'll do that. So what did the Yetzer Hara convince the guy to do? To procrastinate. Come back in a little bit. You don't have to do it right now. Come back in a little bit. Once he was in the street, the battle was won. The second he got this guy to procrastinate, the second he got this guy to take his mind off it for a second, he had already won. I showed him a newsboy shouting in the midday paper, number 73 bus going past. And before he reached the bottom of the steps, I had got him into an unalterable conviction that whatever odd ideas might have come into this man's head when he was shut up alone with his books, a healthy dose of real life was enough to show him that all sorts of things just couldn't be true. He knew he'd have a narrow escape, and in later years was fond of talking about ... So what does the Yetzer Hara do? It actually does two things here which are brilliant. Number one is procrastination. This guy has an epiphany. He says, you know what, I want to change my life. I want to start going to minyan. And the Yetzer Hara comes along and says, start tomorrow night. Your wife needs you home tonight. Guy has an epiphany and says, you know what, Chumash and Rashi, I'm going to start doing Shnai Mikra. The guy says, Shnai Mikra, you're at the end of the Sedras. You're in Kitetse. Why don't you start with a new Seder when you start Brachis? Come back a little bit later. The Yetzer Tov comes back and says, no, this is way too important. You can't push this off. This is much more important than whatever else you're doing. And the Yetzer Hara comes back and says, you're right, way too much important. It's 11 o'clock at night. You can start tomorrow with a fresh mind. That's tactic number one of the Yetzer Hara. Whenever we try to change, the Yetzer Hara has a very simple tactic, and that is to try to get us to push it off to tomorrow, to procrastinate. You'll notice that the Yetzer Hara here does something else very brilliant. What does he do? He gets him caught up in everyday details, right? The midday paper, the number 73 bus going past. So in other words, this guy is thinking about lofty ideas. I'm going to connect to Hashem. I'm going to have dveikus. I'm going to learn a little bit more. And then he realizes, got to go do carpool. Got to go do carpool. I want to do it, but I got to go do carpool. And the second the Yetzer Hara gets the guy to do carpool, he's brought down into the mundane and what he calls here a healthy dose of real life. And then you forget about it. You say, that other stuff, I'm too busy. Minyan, I'm too busy. Making time for learning, I'm too busy. I have real life to live. I can't do that other stuff. That's tactic number one of the Yetzer Hara that I want to talk to you just a little bit about. First of all, this is an explicit Mishnah in Pirkei Avos. The Mishnah says, "V'al tomar likshe'efne eshne shema lo tipana." A person shouldn't say, you know what, when I have time, I'll do it, because you may never have time. In other words, don't push off to tomorrow what you can do today. That's an explicit Mishnah in Pirkei Avos. This is also the backdrop of one of, to me, the most powerful scenes in all of Tanakh. We're going to actually come back at it later on in the class tonight. But the class is as follows. This is from Melachim Aleph, chapter 19. It's really Prakim 18 and 19. But here's what I call the throwdown with Eliyahu and the Nivi'ei Habal at Har HaKarmel. Of course, the Jewish people are participating in idolatry. Eliyahu wants to bring them over to make them realize their fidelity to Hashem. And so there's a throwdown at Har HaKarmel where the Nivi'ei Habal bring their sacrifices. Eliyahu brings his sacrifices, and he challenges them. He says, whichever one is ultimately accepted by God, that is who the correct deity is. And of course, the Nivi'ei Habal bring their sacrifice. Nothing happens, and they're crying, and they're davening, and they're pleading. Nothing happens, and the time is going. The clock is ticking. All of a sudden, it's mincha time. And Eliyahu basically says, guys, you had all day. Now it's my turn. Mincha time, Eliyahu comes out, puts his korban down, says a very short tefillah. All of a sudden, fire comes down and eats up his korban. And it's the most amazing revelation that people had ever seen since really the times of Moshe and the Jews in coming out of Mitzrayim. It was an unbelievable revealed miracle. That's, by the way, why Chazal tell us that mincha is the most auspicious time to have our tefillos answered, because Eliyahu's tefillah was answered at mincha at that day. Well, right after this happens, as you can imagine, the people were dumbfounded. I mean, literally dumbfounded. They couldn't believe what they had just seen. Fire just came down from heaven and ate up Eliyahu's korban. And the pasuk tells us, "Vayar kol ha'am." Everyone is watching this scene. Vayiplu al panehem, and they fall down. They prostrate themselves to God because they can't believe it. Vayomru Hashem hu Elokim. Hashem hu Elokim. They have such an epiphany, an awareness of the presence of God that they scream out, "Hashem is God. Hashem is God." Now, you know these words. These are the climactic words that we say on Yom Kippur. The culmination of Ne'ilah, we scream out 7 times, Hashem hu Elokim, Hashem hu Elokim, Hashem is God, Hashem. It's modeled after this scene of Eliyahu Carmel, because at the end of Ne'ilah, we have that same level of clarity about our relationship with Hashem. We have that same awareness of the presence of Hashem, and so we repeat these exact words that the Jews at Har HaKarmel had felt when they had this epiphany, when they see this great miracle from Eliyahu. Vayar kol ha'am, they see it and they have this epiphany. And there's this almost mass tshuva movement. 10 minutes ago, they were all idolaters. All of a sudden, Hashem hu Elokim, Hashem hu Elokim, they scream out, Hashem, you're my God. Hashem is God. It's the ultimate tshuva movement. Well, what happens a very short little time later? Well, there's a king at the time. His name is Achav, and Achav is equally mesmerized. But Achav has a wife, and his wife is Izebel. And Izebel is wicked and cruel, and she does not like any of this. And she wants to kill Eliyahu because he is a direct threat to her. If she's selling idolatry and he's selling God, then they are in direct opposition to one another. So she has to kill Eliyahu. What do you think would happen to Izebel? If she came at that moment in time, right? This was Mincha, so let's say 5 o'clock in the afternoon. And she came at 6 o'clock in the afternoon with her guards, and she said, Eliyahu, I'm going to kill you. What would happen to her? The people would say, no, you're not. Do you see what this guy just did? This guy just brought fire from the heaven, ate up the korban, and he proved to us that God is in charge. You ain't killing him. So what does Izebel do? Reads the pasuk just a few psukim later. Vatishlach Izebel malach el Eliyahu. Izebel sends a messenger to Eliyahu. Leimar ko yasun Elokim v'chol yosifun. Right? In other words, what you did to me, I'm going to do to you. Ki ka'es machar asim es nafshecha kenefesh echad mehem. That the same way, because Eliyahu then subsequently killed a lot of the false prophets of Baal. She says, the same way you did that to them, I'm going to kill you. V'chol yosifim ki ka'es machar. She says, I'm going to do it tomorrow. Why does she say she's going to do it tomorrow? Why does she wait? She could kill Eliyahu right now. She's the queen. So some say the Mefarshim that the reason why she waits until tomorrow is because this whole mass tshuva movement, this whole Hashem hu Elokim, Hashem hu Elokim, this epiphany, this clarity in our relationship with Hashem, just come back to me tomorrow. Tomorrow, let's see how that religious fervor is holding up. Tomorrow, let's see if people remember that Hashem is God, or did they go back to their desires and their hedonistic ways. Hashem hu Elokim, just let all your plans about how you're going to do tshuva, let's come back tomorrow. By the way, this is the biggest musar I'm going to ever give is right here. Because from the top pasuk to the bottom pasuk is the difference between Ne'ilah and the morning after Ne'ilah, right? Ne'ilah, we're all screaming, Hashem hu Elokim, Hashem hu Elokim, we're going to be different this year, Hashem, I'm going to be the best version of myself, right? By tomorrow, unfortunately, so many of those commitments that we made start to fall away. So Izebel was very in tune to human nature. And that is exactly what Screwtape tells Wormwood to do to his patient. He says, if the guy is going to be inspired, just get him to procrastinate. Get him to push it off till tomorrow. Because if you push it off till tomorrow, then that religious fervor is going to recede, and he's not going to do what he had originally set out to do. This notion of procrastination is explicit in the Chafetz Chaim Sefer as well. The Chafetz Chaim, in his chapter 11, says the following. He says, why don't people do chesed? Right? We spoke about this a little bit on the Behind the Bima last week with Dr. Donath. Why don't people join daily giving? Right? Those who know we're doing our 1-in-1 campaign. Why don't more people join? It's not because the $365 a day. So Dr. Donath himself said, the problem is that people forget about it. They say, oh, what an amazing idea. And then 10 minutes later, they forget about it. It's exactly what the Chafetz Chaim says. It says the Chafetz Chaim, v'yesh anashim, shesibas miniasam mitzvahs gemilas chasadim. There's some people that the reason why they don't do chesed, it's not because they care about the money. They're not worried about the money. Many people have plenty of money. They're lazy. Right? They procrastinate. They put it off. He says, he says, when you think about this, listen to these words, unbelievable. Hi hasiba hagedola. Shebechol hasibos hamoneas adam me'avodas Hashem Yisbarach. This is, says the Chafetz Chaim, the number one reason why people don't succeed more in their service of Hashem. The number one reason. It's not because they don't have good intentions. It's not because they're bad people. It's not because they don't know how. The number one reason, says the Chafetz Chaim, is exactly what Screwtape says to Wormwood in the Screwtape letters, which is that people procrastinate. Because of that, people remain naked from a life of Torah or mitzvos. Because what we do is we push it off. We say, I'll get to it tomorrow. I'll start Chumash and Rashi with Bereishis. What do I have to start with Kiteitzei? That I'll start going to Minyan with Slichos. What do I have to start with today? right? We push it off, and that is the ultimate tactic of the Yetzer Hara. Chafetz Chaim in the footnote over there says something amazing. Pasuk says in Parshas Ekev, Ve'ata Yisrael, Ma Hashem Elokecha shoel me'imach, says the Medrash, Ein ve'ata ela teshuva, that the language of ata and now, that's how it's translated, is a language of tshuva. Ask the Chafetz Chaim in the third line, V'lechaora heichan ramuz teshuva b'tevas ve'ata. How do you know that the word ata is symbolic of teshuva? He says in the fourth line, El aval lo b'tevas ata, nucha lomar de'akavanu zeu masha kasavnu. De'ikar koach ha'yitzer shu mat'eh la'adam lemor. That the Yetzer Hara gets a person, it tricks a person to say, Hayomin lecha pnai lilmod v'lasok mitzvos. Today I don't have a lot of time. Right? Today I don't have a time to do tshuva. L'machar, but tomorrow. Uliyoma achara, and the next day, taseh kol zeh. I'll do it all tomorrow. That is the tactic of the Yetzer Hara, says the Chafetz Chaim. That's what Izebel knew when she knew not to come out of Eliyahu today, because today everyone was filled with a religious fervor. But machar, she comes tomorrow, that'll dissipate. Chafetz Chaim understood that. He says that's the number one. Listen to his language again, right? Because he says, Ki asiba hagedola. This is the reason, shebechol asibos, more than any other reason, why a person remains naked of a life of Torah, mitzvos, and tshuva. This is what Screwtape ultimately tells Wormwood, that if you want to get the guy to give up on his fantasies of religious excellence and becoming a better version of himself, just get him to push it off. If I can get you to procrastinate, then the Yetzer Hara has already won. So lesson number one of the Screwtape letters is don't push it off. Let's not procrastinate. Whatever goals, whatever aspirations we're thinking about, start them now. Allow the month of Elul to be a month to work on things. Don't say I'm going to start on Rosh Hashanah, or I'm going to start on Yom Kippur. I'll get to it when I have time. Start it today. Whatever goal, whatever habits Rabbi Goldberg spoke about last week, start it now. Don't push it off. Pushing off is the tactic of the Yetzer Hara. That is idea number one I want to share with you. Idea number two is, to my mind, and again, so many of these ideas we could develop so much further. I happen to have no svarim on me now, so it's a little bit more challenging, but so many of these we can develop further. I'm giving you little tastes. But here you see the cute comic working as an elevator operator has its ups and downs. Well, you know what else has its ups and downs? Life. Specifically, religion has its ups and downs. I think this relates to all of us. I know it relates to me on a almost daily basis, if not constant basis, which is that we have moments of religious ups and moments of religious downs. There are days when you wake up in the morning and just everything is clicking on all cylinders. Davening was great. Your learning might be great. You're a great parent, right? Everything is just working. You feel good. You feel energized. And then there are days that you just wake up and nothing is working. It's like you're going through the motions, but nobody is home. You're at a minute in the morning, you're saying the words, and it's just like blank screen, right? And you're going through it, and there's no hislavas, there's no excitement, there's no energy. You're just going through the motions. This is nature, and it's also one of the tactics of the Yetzer Hara. And for this, I know it's a little bit small. This is the 8th chapter, the 8th letter from Screwtape to, again, his nephew, the devil in training, Wormwood. I'm going to read it out of my book because since I've last seen you, I've gotten a little older and my eyes aren't what they used to be. But again, I'm happy to send source sheets to anyone who's interested. He says here, my dear Wormwood, so you have great hopes that the patient's religious phase is dying away, have you? I have thought that the training college had gone to pieces since they put old slub job at the head of it. And now I am sure. Has no one ever told you about the law of undulation? And this is exactly what I want to talk to you about today. The law of undulation. Undulating, of course, is going like this. And he says that is human nature. He says humans are amphibians, half spirit and half animal. As spirits, they belong to the eternal world. But as animals, they inhibit time. This means that while their spirit can be directed to an eternal object, their bodies, passions, and imaginations are in continual change. For to be in time means to change. Their nearest approach to constancy, therefore, is undulation. Now, the only thing consistent in our lives is this notion of undulation, right? The repeated return to a level from which they repeatedly fall back, a series of troughs and peaks. That's what I'm going to call like religious highs and religious lows. Troughs and peaks. Some days are like Ne'ilah, where you're on a peak, you're on top of the mountain, everything is clear. And some days are a trough. It's Mar Cheshvan. You haven't had a holiday in a little bit. The winters are creeping upon us. Nights are getting earlier. It's a lot harder to feel that religious excitement, that religious fervor. He says, if you had watched your patient carefully, you would have seen this undulation in every department of his life. His interest in his work, his affection for his friends, his physical appetites all go up and down. And again, you and I have this also, right? In work, sometimes you wake up one day and you feel very fulfilled in your work. Other times you don't feel very fulfilled in your work. You have this in relationships. Marriages we'll talk about in a little bit. Religion, certainly we're going to talk about in a little bit, right? He says, as long as a person lives on earth, right? He says, the dryness and dullness through which your patient is now going are not, as you fondly suppose, your workmanship. In other words, getting a guy not to feel that excitement is not the Yetzer Hara itself. But what is the Yetzer Hara? They are merely a natural phenomenon, which will do us no good unless you make good use of it. In other words, this peak in troughs, that's natural. That's part of being a human being. It's what we do with it, and more importantly, what the Yetzer Hara does with it, that is critical and of importance here. I skipped a paragraph in my source sheets here. He says, and that is where troughs come in. You must have wondered why the enemy does not make more use of his power to be sensibly present to human souls in any degree he chooses at any moment. This is like the most amazing comment ever. Why doesn't the Yetzer HaTov manifest itself in a more prominent fashion to us? Right? Why doesn't God just make it a little bit easier for us? If Hashem revealed himself to us, this whole Judaism thing would be a lot easier. Why does Hashem do that? Why does Hashem do that? So he goes on to describe, I'm not going to read it all inside, obviously, but he goes on to decide that Hashem purposefully pulls himself back. Why? To allow us to exist on our own. Right? That's an amazing idea. Right? To allow us to do it so that we can exist on our own. He leaves the creature to stand up on its own legs, to carry out from the will alone duties which would have lost all relish. In other words, Hashem makes us do it on our own. It is during such periods, such trough periods. In other words, it's during the times where you're not feeling particularly spiritually inspired, much more than during the peak periods, that it is growing into the sort of creature he here being the Yetzer HaTov, wants it to be. In other words, what defines us as a Jew is not the peaks. Peaks are easy. It's easy to feel Hashem in your life at Ne'ilah. That's easy. Anybody can do that, right? It's a lot harder in the middle of the winter, Mar Cheshvan, to then work your way to a level of connection to Hashem, to work your way to spirituality, to work on. You do that in the troughs, he says, that is much more difficult to do, and that ultimately defines you as a person. Okay, so that is letter 8. Letter 9, he continues this idea. And he says, again, we talked about in my last letter, that troughs or dullness or dryness through which your patient is going at present will not in itself give you a soul. In other words, the period of troughs, when that person is feeling spiritually dry, that alone is not the problem. What forms the exploitation should take, I will now consider. Right? It's what the Yetzer Hara does with it. And he's going to go through two things. One, I'm going to skip over quickly because I think it's more obvious. The second, I think, is utterly brilliant. The first one he says is temptation. Right? In the first place, I've always found that trough periods of the human undulation provide excellent opportunities for all sensual temptations. In other words, that's when we're more susceptible to the Yetzer Hara coming along and saying, I can't withstand that temptation. Right? Think about it. When you're anxious and you eat that piece of cake. So that's easy, the Yetzer Hara almost says. It's easy to get you to eat the piece of cake when you're feeling depressed, or you're feeling anxious. Okay? But then he says something that I think is just so brilliant. He says, but there is another, even better way of exploiting the trough. I mean, through the patient's own thoughts about it. As always, the first step is to keep knowledge out of his mind. Do not let him suspect the law of undulation. In other words, if we don't even understand this principle, then we can't overcome it. So the Yetzer Hara wants us to not even realize that there's this period of undulation. Let him assume that his first ardors in this conversation might be expected to last. In other words, the Yetzer Hara wants us to believe that we can live in a Ne'ilah all year round. The Yetzer Hara wants us to believe that I can live with that same level of emotional and spiritual excitement all year round. And therefore, if I don't do that, well, then there's obviously something wrong with me, and I feel bad about myself, and I start becoming depressed. And I start saying, well, obviously this isn't for me after all, because I can't sustain exactly the feeling I had at Ne'ilah. That is the tactic of the Yetzer Hara. And then he says something even more brilliant. He says another possibility is that of the direct attack on his faith. When you have caused him to assume that the trough is permanent. In other words, I missed minyan, I'm not going to be a minyan goer. That's the Yetzer Hara. The Yetzer Hara wants to get you to convince you that the trough is permanent. That if I'm going through a difficult day or difficult month and I'm not feeling that religious excitement and enthusiasm, the Yetzer Hara wants us to convince us, that's me. That's who I am. That is now permanent, right? That this religious phase that I was in has died away like all other previous phases that I've ever gone through. He says, if you can convince this person about that, then you have won, right? If you can convince him that this is not just a phase, but that this is something permanent about himself, then you, the Yetzer Hara, as well. And that's what I think is such a beautiful lesson about the Screwtape letters. And I want to show you, it is a very Jewish idea. This notion of the law of undulation, the periods of peaks and troughs. And again, you got to read this all inside. It is utterly brilliant. I think the book is like $9 on Amazon. I promise you, you will not be disappointed. Okay, this notion of peaks and troughs in Judaism and the danger that it plays, but also the opportunity that it presents us, is a very Jewish idea. Let me show you a couple of sources. The first comes from Rav Shlomo Volbe. In Ali Shor, Rav Volbe, in his 5th chapter, has a beautiful essay called Yemei Ahava v'Yemei Hayesh, or Yemei Hasina, which he calls periods of love and periods of hatred, what Screwtape called troughs and peaks. Right? That there's sometimes, he says here, he quotes from the Sefer Hayashar of Rabbeinu Tam. He says in the 2nd paragraph, Kol hamaschil la'asos shum ma'isa. He said, when you first start doing something, im yeh lo b'ma'isa shum hana, tikanes bo hataiva. Right? When you first start doing something, there's that enormous excitement. The first day you put on tefillin, right? I remember when my son first put on tefillin that first day, I was like mesmerized by the excitement that he felt. First time you do a mitzvah, first time you recognize the meaning, the beauty of davening. So it's like amazing. It's like a light bulb go off. It's going from black and white to seeing the world in high definition 3D color. He says, Kikain kol ma'aseh sheyesh shum hana, tikanes belibo ha'ava rishona. And when you first start doing something, there's that first love. And it's amazing. And everything is clear. And everything is easy. That's the peak. But then he says, Va'achar kain tasur v'tikanes belibo hasina. But what ultimately comes after the peak? What Screwtape called the trough, and what Ali Shor calls the Yemei Sinna. In other words, things stop being as easy as they were. Right? That same fervency and amazing clarity you had in davening yesterday. Well, you know what? Today I got like 4 hours of sleep last night, and I'm just going through the motions. Right? And honestly, davening is a little bit of a burden right now. In the learning that Daf of Gemara that like yesterday I learned and it was like amazing and clear, and it just came to me today. I've been working on the same line over and over again for hours on end, and I'm like breaking my head against a wall. And I can't get it together. And I'm not feeling it. That's what Ali Shor calls Yemei Ava v'Yemei Sinna. It's the peaks and the troughs that that Screwtape had told Wormwood about. The best English version of this, from a Jewish perspective, comes from Living Inspired by Rabbi Akiva Tatz. And again, if you read nothing else from this, go find the book and read this chapter, Inspiration and Disappointment. He says, or why a good time never lasts. Says Rabbi Tatz, the natural pathway of all life's experiences begin with inspiration. That's the peak. That's the Yemei Ava. And soon fades into disappointment. Let us analyze the phenomenon and understand it. Human consciousness and human senses are tuned to an initial burst of sensitivity and then rapidly decay into dullness. So there's that initial burst and then dullness. Sights, sounds, smells, even tactile stimuli are often felt sharply at first and then hardly at all. A constant sound is not registered, right? You hear that buzzing in the room? Eventually, you're not going to hear it. One suddenly becomes aware that it is present only when it is stopped. We are incapable of maintaining the freshness of any experience naturally. Only in the dimension of a miracle is that possible. He says, right, this is exactly what happens at Yetzias Mitzrayim. Yetzias Mitzrayim, Hashem gives that burst, right? The makos, the splitting of the sea. But then what happens? We go into the desert. right? We hit Parshas Ba'aloscha and Bamidbar, and the Jewish people start complaining. They're like, get us out of here. This is boring. The man is boring. We don't want it anymore, right? That's exactly what it is. There's that initial burst of inspiration, and then it's followed by disappointment or dullness. He says, this is the secret of life. A person is inspired artificially at the beginning of any phase of life, but to acquire the depth of personality which is demanded of us, Hashem removes the inspiration. Again, compare, that's literally exactly out of Screwtape letters, where he says, why does the Yetzer Hara Tov, remove himself? Because he wants us to learn how to experience it on our own. So first, that there's that initial burst, but then Hashem removes himself. And the real growth comes when we work at it and accomplish it on our own. The danger is apathy and depression. That is the Yetzer Hara speaking. That's what Screwtape told Wormwood. Make the person feel depressed that he's going through the lack of religious inspiration. The challenge is to fight back to the point of inspiration, and doing so, to build it permanently into one's character. So there's that initial burst of inspiration. Then Hashem removes it. He pulls himself back, and we're left in that trough. We're left in the Yemei Sinna that Revolbi speaks about. And that is where the religious growth happens. Because that's where we have a choice. Do we follow the Yetzer Hara and allow it to make us depressed and disappointed and apathetic? Or do we work hard, tooth and nail, to fight back to that level of inspiration, earning it on our own, and therefore embedding it into our personality? He says that's exactly what happened in Mitzrayim. And then he says in the next paragraph, a second application is life, right? Childhood, everything is new, everything's excited. Then you come to a teenager and nothing's new, nothing's exciting, everything is cynical, right? And again, you have to now work at it. You have to make it your own. So the first time you put on tefillin, beautiful, filled with inspiration. By the 7,000th time you put on tefillin, you're just going through the motions. And the challenge is now to make it your own, to come back to that level of inspiration, understanding, commitment that you had originally. He says a third application on the top of the next hand column is a Baal Tshuva, right? Think about a Baal Tshuva. When you're first Baal Tshuva, everything's amazing. Judaism is amazing. Torah mitzvah is amazing. Shabbos is amazing. Everything's amazing. And then you've been doing it a year or two, it becomes a lot harder. Shabbos isn't as excited as it was at Esha Torah a couple of years ago. Right now, I have a family who's screaming and barking and throwing things at each other. That's not the Shabbos table I signed up for. So now it's a lot harder. Now I have to work at it. That's the trough, peaks and troughs. He says the sharpest application of this idea in modern Western society is marriage, right? You see that newlywed couple and they're looking at each other and nauseating with googly eyes and, making kissy faces at each other. Everything is romantic and love. And then you come back to them 6 months later when it's time to do the dishes and take out the garbage and go to work. And you know what? That peak is now a trough. And now is when the relationship ultimately is built. Now is when you have to work at it. Now is when it really separates the men from the boys, because you don't have that artificial inspiration, but rather now you have to work harder at it as well. So it's this peaks and troughs, the law of undulation that Screwtape tells Wormwood about. It's the exact same that Revolbi speaks about in Yemei Ava and Yemei Sinna. It's the exact same as Akiva Tatz talks about in inspiration and disappointment, this law of undulation. The key for us is to understand it and therefore to be willing to fight through it. So when we experience those troughs, not to listen to the Yetzer Hara, which is convincing us that it's permanent, that this is who I am, or to give up, or to be disappointed, or to be depressed, but to recognize it for what it is, that it's a trough. And you know what? My davening might not be as good as it was in Neila, but just showing up today shows a lot about me. And that's part of the growth process. And I'm going to feel good about that as opposed to feeling bad about myself. That's how we overcome this tactic of the Yetzer Hara. This is a very Hasidic idea. I brought for you one source, Likutei Maharan. In Breslov, it's called Baki Barshov, Baki Barov, which means you have to be good at the troughs and good at the peaks, literally straight out of this. He says here, this is the secret of the intentions of Elul, that one who wishes to begin the path of tshuva needs to brace himself and be ready to be strong in all ways of Hashem, whether going up or going down. He says, Bein ba'aliyah, bein b'yerida. In other words, whether you're going through that peak or whether you're going through that trough. He says that's the pasuk in Tehillim, where we say, Imesak shamayim ve'atzia sha'ol. Right? If I climb up to the heavens, then Hashem's there, or if I dig down to the world, so you're also there. In other words, whether I'm in that peak, you're there, Hashem, or whether I'm in the trough, you're there, Hashem, as well. And again, you can read that on your own, but that's that notion of being Baki Berov and Baki B'Shov. Baki means to be an expert in. So I have to be an expert in the peaks. What does that mean? It means that when things are going well, I have to jump on it. When I'm feeling that excitement, when I'm feeling that passion, so I got to take more on, I got to do more. But I also have to be a Baki B'Shov. When I'm going through that trough, when I'm going through that difficult time, I have to know how to manage that. I have to know how to overcome that Yetzer Hara and to not let it get me and to make the most out of that difficult situation. That's what it means to be a Baki B'Shov, according to Rav Nachman of Breslov. I have here from Melech Biederman, where he quotes the Chidushei Arim, B'chol nafshecha, right? What does it mean that Hashem, we have to serve Hashem B'chol nafshecha? So that means even if Hashem takes our nefesh, even if Hashem takes our life. He says, what does it mean then? B'chol levavcha, afilu notel es levavcha. If Hashem takes our heart, knows Hashem takes our inspiration. There are times in life when you feel no inspiration. Gam az, even in those troughs. Even in the troughs, you have to learn to serve Hashem. That's what it means, b'chol levavcha. So this idea of the law of undulation, first of all, I think it's just so in tune with human nature. Every single person listening to this has felt that in their life. I hope all of you are saying, oh, I feel that all the time. Sometimes I'm feeling it, sometimes I'm not feeling it, but it's what we do with it. Do we allow the Yetzer Hara to win? Or are we Baki B'Shov, like Rav Nachman talks about? Do we learn how to manage those periods of trough and to actually utilize them to make us stronger in the long run? And that is idea number 2 that I wanted to share with you. Idea number 3 comes from the Music Man. We got trouble right here in River City. I'm dating myself. That's what my bubby, when I used to go to my bubby's house, she used to put on Music Man, so I know that. Those who are familiar with Music Man knows that iconic scene where they open up a billiard hall in the town, and he comes, the Music Man, I forgot his name, I'm sorry right now, but he comes to town square and he starts warning everyone that we got trouble right here in River City. And the whole premise of that song, first of all, the words to that song are brilliant. You should go Google them. They're really amazing. But he says, what's the whole premise? Is that right now it's billiards, right? Something so innocuous, something so small. But eventually billiards is going to lead to what we say in Judaism, it's going to lead to mixed dancing. That's actually what he says. It's going to lead to mixed dancing. So small things, which might seem innocuous now, actually become much bigger things. And that is ultimately another tactic of the Yetzer Hara. Says Screwtape to Wormwood in letter number 12. He says, obviously you are making excellent progress. My only fear is lest in attempting to hurry the patient, you awaken him to a sense of his real position. In other words, what the Yetzer Hara tries to do is to change us negatively, but in very small incremental ways, so that we don't even notice the Yetzer Hara got us. In other words, if the Yetzer Hara really pounces on us, then we're going to be like, whoa, that was a big mistake. But that's not what the Yetzer Hara does. Guess us to eat a little bit more cake today than yesterday. And then we want the cookie. And then the next day, maybe a potato chip, right? As little by little, we give up on our diet. He doesn't give us to throw out our diet today. Little by little, I give up on my diet. For you and I, who see the position as it really is, must never forget how totally different it ought to appear to him. We know that we have introduced a change of direction in his course, which is already carrying him out of his orbit around the enemy. But he must be made to imagine that all the choices that have affected this change of course are trivial and irrevocable. Because this guy has to believe, the Yetzer Hara wants us to believe that all of these changes, they're small. All right, so I came to shul 5 minutes late today. All right, so I ate another potato chip today. What's the big deal? What's the big deal? It's just a little small change. He must not be allowed to suspect that he is now, however slowly, heading right away from the sun on the line, which will carry him into the cold and dark of utmost place, which of course is a good place for us, right? For this reason, I'm almost glad to hear that he is still a churchgoer and a communicant. You know, he says, I'm glad to go, he still goes to shul. I know there are dangers in this, but anything is better than he should realize the break he has made in the first months of Christian life. As long as he retains externally the habits of a Christian, he can still be made to think of himself as one who has adopted a few friends and amusements. but whose spiritual state is as much the same as 6 weeks ago. This is like brilliant. The Yetzer Hara wants you to go to shul. It is fine if you go to shul, because as long as you're living a life externally that you feel Jewish, but like it's void of anything on the inside, that's the tactic of the Yetzer Hara. So I might still go to shul, but I used to show up at 9:15. Now I'm showing up at 9:16. And I don't really think that's a big deal because it's so small and trivial and revocable. So that's the tactic of the Yetzer Hara. The Yetzer Hara does not try to overwhelm us with temptation. The Yetzer Hara tries to change us little by little so that we don't even notice that the Yetzer Hara is trying to change us. The end of this, I think, is we could talk about this for hours. But the notion of that it's actually a tactic of the Yetzer Hara to get us to live externally a Jew. Right, with external habits of a Jewish person. So the ultimate tactic of the Yetzer Hara is the guy who comes to shul, but sits in the back, talks, goes to get right. That's the Yetzer Hara, because the guy thinks that ultimately he's a good person. Right, I came to shul this morning. What you don't realize is it's the Yetzer Hara who's slowly gotten you out of the mindset of a fidelity to the particular details of halacha. Little by little, he's numbed you. Little by little, he's taken you away. This is also obviously a very Jewish idea. He says, at the end of that paragraph, at the end of that chapter, so again, it's just the same idea. He said, you will say that these are very small sins. Right? What's the big deal? So the guy showed up at 9:16 instead of 9:15. What's the big deal? In doubt, I ate a potato chip today. It doesn't mean I gave up on my diet. What's the big deal? And doubtless, like all young tempters, you are anxious to be able to resort to spectacular wickedness. But do remember, the only thing that matters is the extent to which you separate the man from the enemy. All the Yetzer Hara wants us to do is be separated from the Yetzer HaTov, to be going in a direction that's opposite his current direction. It does not matter how small the sins are, provided that their cumulative effect is to edge the man away from the light and out into the nothing. Murder is no better than cards if cards can do the trick. What a great line, right? Murder is no better than cards if cards can do the trick. That's ultimately right, the billiards. That's the billiards analogy, right? That they open up a billiards hall and the guy says that's going to lead to mixed dancing. So murder is no better than cards if cards can do the trick. Why? Because cards, little by little, then he's gambling, then he's stealing. Indeed, the safest road to hell is the gradual one, the gentle slope, soft underfoot with sudden turns, without milestones, without signposts. You want to put something, obviously the flip side of that is also true, which is the safest road to heaven is also a gradual one. In other words, you don't need spectacular changes. The Yetzer Hara tries to get us with small, incremental, little changes, gradual one, right? That, again, you can meditate on for hours and hours on it. This is a very Jewish idea. This is ultimately why we have a shofar. I quote here from the Rambam in Hilchos Tshuva, where the Rambam says, Afal pisha tkiyas shofar b'Rosh Hashanah gzeras hakasav remez yishbo kolomar uru yishenu mishanaschem. What is the shofar doing? The shofar is waking us up because we've been lulled gradually by the Yetzer Hara, and we don't even realize that we've changed negatively over the year. We don't even realize that one potato chip quickly became a whole bag each and every day. We don't even realize that 9:16 suddenly became 9:46, right? Because it was a slow, incremental change. We don't even realize it. The imagery, right, of that famous thing about the frogs, that if you drop a frog into boiling water, it's going to jump out. But if you drop a frog into warm water, so it'll stay in there, won't realize it's dangerous, and ultimately it'll die. That's the Yetzer Hara. That's what the shofar is supposed to do. The shofar is supposed to waken us up from the slumber, right? Uru yeshenu mishanaschem. Wake up. V'zichru borechem. Remember, you're going in the wrong direction. Elu hashochim es ha'emes behevlei hazman v'shogim kol shnasam behevel rik. Right? Again, we've been turned away from the path of correctness. And that's ultimately what the shofar is there to do. This is also what Rabbeinu Yonah writes in Sharei Tshuva, where he talks about the Gemara in Yoma, which says, Amar Rav Huna, Kevan Sha'avar Adam Avera Vishanabo Nasas Lo Keheter. That once a person has done an Avera again, so now it becomes permissible. Right? So the first time I ate that chip, okay, I might have felt bad about it. But by the second, third, fourth time, now already it's permissible to me. Says the Rabbeinu Yonah, Shenis Ki Hashonem Becheto, someone who becomes accustomed to certain sins, even small ones, Teshuvaso Kasha, becomes much more difficult now to do tshuva. Ki nase lo hachet keter, because now that sin has become permissible. Uvazeh kavda me'od chataso, and that actually compounds the sin. That's what the Yetzer Hara tries to do. It doesn't try to overwhelm us with temptation. It tries to get us to do one little thing wrong, which ultimately then becomes permissible to us. And then once it's permissible, it'll push the envelope just a little bit more until 9:18 becomes permissible. And then 9:19, and then 9:20. And before I realize it, I'm showing up a half hour late, but I didn't even realize that, because that's the tactic of the Yetzer Hara. The Yetzer Hara tries us to gradual sins. The road to hell, as he says, is paved with gradual sins, the gentle slope, sudden things without milestones, without signposts. That's ultimately what El is about. It's to wake us up, to recognize the path that we're on, and to change course where necessary. Next idea I want to share with you is something that he could say and I can't say. I'm not going to actually offer a lot of commentary on this. This one, I think, speaks for itself. As they say in learning, Hamevin Yafin. Those who understand, understand. Says Screwtape to Wormwood. My dear Wormwood, you mentioned casually in your last letter that the patient has continued to attend one church, and only one, since he was converted, and that he is not wholly pleased with it. May I ask what you are about? Why have I no report of the causes of his fidelity to the parish or church? Do you realize that unless it is due to indifference, it is a very bad thing? Understand what Screwtape is saying? He's saying it's a bad thing that the guy only goes to one shul. Surely you know that if a man can't be cured of church going, if I can't convince the guy not to go to shul, listen to these words. The next best thing is to send him all over the neighborhood looking for the shul that suits him until he becomes a taster or connoisseur of churches. Again, I'm going to let this one speak for itself. But Screwtape tells Wormwood the tactic of the Yetzer Hara is if you can't get a guy to stop going to shul, the next best thing is to get him to be a taster of shuls, to send him all over the neighborhood looking for the perfect shul that's going to suit him, right? The reason he goes, he says, the reasons are obvious. Why is it best for a guy to be church hopping or shul hopping? In the first place, the parochial organization should always be attacked because being a place of unity and not of likings, it brings people of different classes and psychology together in the kind of unity the enemy desires, right? Hashem wants us to be unified, right? Am echad, we are one person. Vayichan sham, Yisrael neged ahar, ki ish echad b'lev echad. We're one people. So if a shul is by definition a place of unity, then the Yetzer Hara wants to get people to look at multiple shuls because they undermine that sense of unity. Unity, of course, is central to Rosh Hashanah. Pasuk says, Vayhi bishur melech bis asef rashi am. And the Chazal say, right, when is Hashem a melech? When there is bis asef rashi am, when the people are together, when there's that sense of unity amongst the congregation. So he says, number one, I want the guy to be shul hopping because shul, by definition, should be a place of unity. That's what the Yetzer Hara Tov, that's what Hashem ultimately desires. And so if we can undermine that sense of unity, that is the tactic of the Yetzer Hara. But then he says, the second place, the search for a suitable church makes the man a critic, where the enemy wants him to be a pupil. What he wants of laymen in church is an attitude which may indeed be critical in the sense of rejecting what is false, but which is wholly uncritical in the sense that it does not appraise, does not waste time in thinking about what he rejects, but lays itself open in uncommenting, humble receptivity to any nourishment that is going on. In other words, the Yetzer Hara, by making us shul hop, is trying to turn us into critics. That shul the rabbi speaks for 17 minutes instead of 15 minutes. And that shul, the Kiddush clubs, right? Everything they're critical of everything. No one place is perfect. Instead of just accepting it, okay, it might not be perfect, but it's good enough. I'm blessed to be here. No, the Yetzer Hara wants us to convince us to be critical. And once we're critical human beings, then the Yetzer Hara is one. As I think Oscar Wilde says, I'm going off the cuff here, but I think the critic knows the cost of everything and the value of nothing. So the Yetzer Hara wants us to wants to make us critical. He says this especially during sermons, right, creates this condition, which platitudes can become readily audible to human soul. There's hardly any sermon or any book which may not be dangerous to us if it is received in this temper. In other words, a person who is not critical, so then a sermon is very dangerous. Right? The tactic of the Yetzer Hara is to develop us into critical human beings. This shuls, this for me and that shuls, that for me and this shuls, this and that, to hop around shuls. That chevra is the Yetzer Hara. Again, I'm going to let this speak on itself. I'll just share with you one source that I think is great. This is from Shlomo Freifeld, the biography, the Art Score biography. He says the following. He was asked to speak at the opening of a new base medrash in Brooklyn. In his remarks, Rabbi Freifeld said, quote, "Tonight, I have traveled from Far Rockaway to Flatbush. As I was crossing the Marine Park Bridge, I realized suddenly that I was in an alien world. I realized that the basic institution we take for granted in Far Rockaway, the Kehila, does not exist here." Now, obviously, this is somewhat dated. "There are, Baruch Hashem, many shuls. There are wonderful yeshivas. But there is no organic entity where people feel that they are in a common enterprise together, with a spiritual leader to have a Torah and Kedusha penetrate all aspects of their lives. I came tonight because I see hope that a Kehila can take root here in Brooklyn. Today, if you ask someone in which shul they daven, they ask you, what do you mean? On Friday night, I daven here unless it's raining, but on Shabbos that day, go there. And then every tefillah, a different shul. Says Rabbi Freifeld, that is not tefillah, that is a shopping spree. And says Screwtape to Wormwood, that is the tactic of the Yetzer Hara. And again, I'm going to not issue my commentary on that other than to issue a plea that the same way that the Yetzer Hara tries to become ununified around the time, that's his tactic. So around this time of the year, Elul, Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, we should all commit ourselves to being more unified than we were previously. Now we're going to go to the lightning round. These are just two quick ideas, and my 4 minutes left that, again, quotes that I think can really develop into much bigger ideas. We don't have enough time to go through everything. But again, I think hopefully you'll find them meaningful as well. Number one, this was back in letter number 9 when we was talking about the law of undulation. I just want to highlight one phrase that we may have skipped over there, and it's the following. He says, talk to him about moderation in all things. Again, this is Screwtape talking to Wormwood. He says, convince your guy to do things in moderation. If you can once get him to the point of thinking that religion is very well up to a point, you can feel quite happy about his soul. A moderated religion is as good for us as no religion at all and more amusing. A moderated religion is as good for us as no religion at all. Now, obviously, we don't believe that in Judaism, right? Obviously, some Judaism is better than none, but you understand the point here. The point here is that the Yetzer Hara tries to convince us, don't be so frum, don't be so zealous, don't be so inspired. A moderated religion, right? I'm socially Jewish, right? Whatever term you want to use, right? That is the tactic of the Yetzer Hara. This, again, I'm bringing us back to that scene of Eliyahu, Hara Carmel. This is exactly what Eliyahu told the people that were standing around. Vayigash Eliyahu el kol ha'am. Eliyahu approached the people. Vayomer ad matai atem poschim al shtei hasifim. How long are you going to hop between two sides? Im Hashem Elokim l'chu acharav. Vima ba l'chu acharav. In other words, you're in this wishy-washy territory right now. You're moderated religion. You're neither here nor there. You have 1 foot in and 1 foot out. He says, you know what? Whatever you're going to do, just do it. If you're going to follow Baal, go all in on Baal. If you're going to be following God, then go all in on God. But none of this moderated, half-baked Judaism type thing, that is the tactic of the Yetzer Hara. Again, I think something very much to think about. We don't have time to develop it, but do we live moderated Jewish lives? Do we live moderate Jewish lives where we're willing to throw ourselves in with passion and excitement and enthusiasm, willing to make ourselves vulnerable and really go all in on Judaism and a religious experience? Or are we satisfied with that moderated Jewish experience that the Yetzer Hara is trying to convince us of? And lastly, in the last minute and a half that I have, this is from letter number 4. Screwtape says, it's funny how mortals always picture us as putting things into their minds, right? As we think the Yetzer Hara is trying to put negative thoughts into our minds. But that's not the case, he says. In reality, our best work is done by keeping things out. The Yetzer Hara wants to keep things out of our minds. Because if we're not thinking about things, if we're going through life mindlessly, by rote, in a robotic, monotonous fashion, then the Yetzer Hara has won. The more we think, then the Yetzer Hara is lost. And so I thought this just spoke to me that we think the Yetzer Hara's ultimate tactic is putting thoughts into our mind. He says it's actually the opposite. It's by keeping things out of our mind. It's by keeping us idle. It's by preventing us from being mindful of the things that we're doing, by just saying brachas by rote, not thinking about the role that Hashem plays in our life, by sitting through davening and having our mind wander, but not actually focusing on the opportunity we have to speak to our Creator. That is all the tactic of the Yetzer Hara. It's not about putting things into our mind, but it's actually about keeping things out. And so with that, we conclude our class on the Screwtape letters. I hope that you found it to be as meaningful as I do. Again, it's a short book. It's 31 letters between Screwtape and Wormwood. Some of the letters are a little bit more difficult to understand than others, but I promise you, money back guaranteed, $9 on Amazon. If you don't feel you got your money's worth, you can come and complain to me. But if you read it and you read it well and you really study it and you meditate over many of its themes, so you'll start to learn the tactics of the Yetzer Hara. And as we started off with, B'chol levavcha, b'Yetzer HaTov u'b'Yetzer Hara, b'shnei yitzrecha, we have to serve Hashem. And so the more that we can understand the tactics of the Yetzer Hara, how the Yetzer Hara tries to get us to sin, so now we can be equipped to fight back and to become that best version of ourselves, to make the most of the month of Elul, Rosh Hashanah, and Yom Kippur, to bring ourselves back to who we really want to be. Again, it was so wonderful to learn with all of you here tonight. I miss you. I look forward to learning in person soon. And again, we should only hear Besoros Tovos, Yeshuos, V'nechamos, wishing everyone a wonderful evening.